Next, let's add Angular routing to our Angular app. In this module, we're going to add routing to the project. We're going to create routes. I'll show you how to use tokens in Angular. I'll introduce you to form binding and validation. And finally, we'll complete the checkout process by sending our order to the server. Let's get started. So let's start by adding routing to our project. Back in Visual Studio, we're going to want to add routing to the project. And the whole idea behind routing for us is to be able to show different pages and to be able to use the semantics of going back and forth without actually going back to the server to serve a new Razor page or a new view. We want this entire shopping experience to be in the browser without having to go back to the server to refresh the page over and over again. It's the whole reason we're using Angular to create a single page application. And routing is key to that. So let's see how this works. We're going to open up the source of our app. I'm going to create a new folder called Pages. And this is going to be for individual pages that we can navigate to. And I'm going to call our first page the shop page. And we're going to continue to name them the same way we've been naming the others. Shop page component.ts. And we'll go ahead and create it like we've done before, which is to export a class. And in our case, this will be called a shop page. And we're going to use component to define the template URL, which will be shoppage.component.html like we've done before. And we're going to want our selector to be shop page. Now under that, let's go ahead and create a new file, shop page components.html, to store our actual HTML for this page. Let's get rid of all that boilerplate. We're going to go down and open up our app component.html and just copy it all because we're going to put it in our shop page component.html instead. We're really just moving this functionality up one level because this is one of the particular pages we want to show. So this will be one of the pages we want to show. We also want to add some existing items from our resource folder. If we look at that resources folder, we're going to want to grab these 3 pieces of checkout. I could have created these with you, but this helps us get this done quicker. So here we have a page to shop at and a page to check out. And that'll be the flow of our users. Pick some products, then we'll take them to the checkout page. So now that we have a couple of pages defined, we're going to need one more thing, and that is an object called a router. So I'm going to create a new directory called router, and I'm just going to create a default index.ts file. Because what I really want to do is export a default router object. Now, of course, we haven't defined what that router is, but let's start with that, knowing that we want to export this object that knows about the different routes that our application can support. And we're going to do that by creating an array of routes. These routes are going to contain just a couple pieces of information. They're going to contain a path, and that's going to be the path that that route matches. Now, this is a lot like the way MVC works. It's going to look for a path that matches and then try to send people to one of the pages. And how do we know what those pages are? We're going to specify what the component is. And for us, this is going to be our shop page. So let's break these out into their own lines just so it can be a little bit more compact. When the path is going to be checkout, then our component can be checkout, right? And so the path we're dealing with is going to be determined to figure out which of these pages to show. And how do we actually create that router then? We're going to create the router by calling something called the router module, which we'll go ahead and import as well. And we're going to call for route. Now, for route says this is going to be the top level routing for our application. We can actually create child routes as well, but we won't be doing that in this course. We're just going to pass in that route information. This is going to create a router object for us and allow us to return it. So what do we do now that we have the router to tell Angular that we want to use the router? This is just define the rules about what those pattern matches are going to be. We come back to our app module. We're going to want to include in the imports here our router. And if we can see, we can just import it directly from router. Now notice we don't have the curly braces here, and we don't have them because we told it to export the default object as a router. If we had more than one thing to return from there, we could do it a little differently, but this will be good enough to get us started. So because we've included the router here, it will try to use this object when loading up the Angular app. But we need to have a way to show it what we want to show. So let's go ahead and open up that app component.html again. And in this case, instead of us showing a product list and a cart, let's actually change this to column 12 so it uses the entire page. We're actually going to create an object called router outlet. And this basically says, this is where we're going to put those pages when they exist. So we have our title of our app, and then we have this router outlet. Let's go back to the app module because we're going to need to include our pages here as well. So remember, we don't just have these product list views now. We're going to need the shop page. Let's go ahead and import that. And we'll do a checkout page. Let's bring that in. And that way both of our pages are included. Now that we have everything declared the way we need to, we can go back to the terminal and just make sure that it's still building. If you're just coming back to this module fresh, you're going to need to make sure that you have ng-build running with watch inside the client directory, just like we had for the last two modules. We go ahead and run this, and then go to that shop page. It's going to ask us to log in again. And then, of course, with luck, it should just show us. But this is asking us to specify something called an app-based href. This is a basic element that says, oh, where is your application running? Let me show you two ways to get around this so you can decide which makes more sense for your application. First of all, back in our router, there's an option here that allows us to say, use hash true. And in that case, it doesn't need to know what page you're on because it's actually going to use, if we refresh this page, a hash before the router. This is often what's thought of as interpage linking. And so you may have seen this on other websites where this part is the URL to the page on the server, and then after the hash is everything on the client side. And so if we change this to checkout, it'll take us to our checkout page, which of course we haven't implemented. We just have sort of it set up there, but it's going to allow us to use the history of the web page to go back and forth. But what's interesting here is that back and forth is only changing the state of the Angular app. It's not actually going back to the server every time. And that's an important idea. Alternatively, we can come back to our application and actually let's go to the page that this is going to live on, which is down here in views, app, shop, right? And in our head, we can actually use a base href to say what is the base of our page. And what this allows it to do is to know where to put the linking of the pages separate from that. So we can actually just say, because we know this, that it's going to be app shop, right? It's going to be the base ref of this particular page. If we look at here, this is going to be the base href. You don't need the entire project. You just need the base href. And if we do that and we turn off the use hash, our page will work again, but we won't need that hash in there. In this case, when we go to checkout, takes us to that checkout page, and this back and forth is all done in Angular. And so this can be a cleaner way so that the user doesn't necessarily know that there's an Angular page here or not. And so we're going to leave it with this base href. It's normally in the header, like we put it in, and allow the routing to handle what is in this part of the URL. So back in Visual Studio, let's make one more page so we can actually see this actually work. So let's go to our cart view. And at the bottom of our cart view, right after the table, we're going to create an anchor here. This anchor is just going to say checkout, right? And we want to make it look like a button. So we'll use Bootstrap to do that by saying button and button success. What we want to use is an attribute called router link. In this case, we can go directly to one of those paths in our router object, right? And so we say we want to go to checkout. We're going to add one more thing, and that is to say only allow this or make this disappear unless the store order items length is greater than 0. So you might want to make sure that we can't go to checkout until the store has at least one item in this. Let's make sure we make changes and save all of these files. And now that we have that change, let's go ahead and buy something and buy something. And you'll notice that we were able to get the checkout to appear as soon as we bought the first thing. And what does this do? When we hover over it, we can see that it's linking us over to that checkout page. So when we click there, we can go to this checkout page. And in fact, it's getting the data already from the order to show us the whole total. So we haven't implemented the complete purchase, but we can, with the cancel, go back to the original page. And because this shop is outside of each of those pages, we continue to keep that state as we go back and forth. None of this is happening on the server. It's all happening on the client. And that's an important idea here. We buy a third item, go to checkout, all 3 of those items now show up. Make sense? Let's secure this next. Now let's support logging in directly in the Angular app itself. Back in Visual Studio, let's go to our controllers for a minute. And if you remember, in our app controller, we have been using authorize to get to the shop page. This is actually not really what we want, because I want people to be able to shop before they log in or before they create an account. So I'm going to get rid of that so we can now go to shop without having to have an account. But that means that before we check out, we're going to need to know who they are. And let me clean some of these up. So now we should be able to go to the shop page without authenticating. But how are we going to actually store this information and figure out how to authenticate in the Angular app directly? So what we're going to do is actually start at the store. To open up that store service, we're going to add a couple of new pieces of information. Remember, we have the products in the order here. We're also going to add a token, which will start as just an empty string. And remember that TypeScript is going to infer this as a string for us. And then do the same thing for expiration. And here we're going to assign it a new date, which should be the date right now, so that this expiration should be expired immediately unless we assign it something later. So let's add a new getter called login required. Now we're going to implement this as a property instead of a method, more to allow it to just be read-only and to be treated as a property. And this is going to be a Boolean property. Let's not forget those parentheses after the login required. And in our case, we're going to return this .token.length is equal to 0. So if the token's empty or the expiration is less than right now. And of course, Boolean instead of bool, because I'm a C# programmer. I always get that mistake wrong. And so essentially, we're going to be able to check to see if the login was required. When we start the new app, login will be required. But after we do login and fill in this information, this should be able to show us that it's not required. What we want to use this information for is in the routes itself. We'd like the router to be able to tell us what pages require login or not. And the way we're going to do this is we're going to add a new service called authActivator.service.ts as a new class that we're going to be able to use here in the router. I'm going to export a new class called authActivator, and it's going to be injectable as a dependency to other things. And for us, we're going to want this to implement an interface called canActivate. You put the S on implements and get this from the router. Notice this is an interface from the router itself, and then we can tell it to implement the interface for us. And so this canActivate is giving us information about the state, both the route, the snapshot, and it's going to return one of these types. We're going to be using it just for Boolean, to be honest with you, to do some work. And so how do we figure out whether this view can be activated or not? This auth activator is actually going to be used to say which of the routes require authentication. And so all we really need to do is check to see if login is required. And we do that by creating a constructor, and we're going to bring in the store. Remember, that's where we had just created the new property. We can say if this.store login required. Login required, we're going to return a false here because we're going to say, hey, by the way, we don't want you to go to that page. Otherwise, return true. We're going to need to navigate to a page we're about to create called the login page. In order to do this, we're going to need another injected object that we'll call router, and we'll define it as a router. This is an injectable type from the Angular routing. You can see this is router to Angular/router, so that we can then here just say this.router.navigate. Where we're going to navigate. This takes a set of navigations, and here we're just going to say login. Now this login needs to be in the routes. So let's go over to our router for a moment, and let's create a new route for path login, and then component login page, right? Which of course doesn't exist right now. So we're going to need to come back and fix that in a minute. And what we're going to want to do in pages, go ahead and create a login page.component.ts. And like we've done before, we're going to export a class called login page. We're going to add the components, which we'll import. And then we're going to need a couple of things. We're going to need a selector, which we'll just call login. Though we're actually not going to use a selector, but I've found it good practice to go ahead and create it in every case. And the second thing we'll need is that template URL. And that template URL is going to be login page component.html. Now, I've already written this for you, so just like we did with checkout, let's go ahead and add an existing item. And let's just get it in this login component. And we can see I've just set up a very simple form, haven't made it work in any way, but it's just going to be a page that we can then go to. So let's close that for now. We'll come back and do some things there. And let's go to this login page and just import the login page from the components for us so that we have our router correct. And of course, we've added a new element. So we're going to need to go back to the app module and add login page and bring that in as well. And so, one of the challenges with Angular is to make sure that you have everything in the module that you need. And you can start thinking about breaking it up into different modules for different parts of your application to simplify this or to build it into more of a tree structure. But we're not going to do that in this very abbreviated version of Angular. You can certainly see how to do that in a number of the other courses here at Pluralsight. Let's go back to the router because, of course, we started this all introducing this idea of an auth activator. We're going to actually use that here in the routes. We're going to allow anyone to come to the shop page to shop. And to protect this page, we're going to use something called can activate, which is a property that says we want you to check with our activator. So we can say auth activator, though this can be one or more can activate filters if you want to think about it that way. So it has to be within an array here. And we could protect more than one page. We could have this on the shop page as well. But again, our goal here is to allow people to shop without logging in. Only when they check out do we actually need all that information. And let's go ahead and put one more route here that's important. And that is a fallback route. In this case, we're going to say if none of the other routes work, because again, the routes are checked in order, just like in ASP.NET. And instead of having a component to go to, we're going to say redirect to, and then where do we want to redirect it to? The shop page, right? Just a blank slash. And the last thing we need to do is this auth activator needs to be injectable. Now, if you remember, we said, make this injectable, but as with everything Angular, that's not enough. We have to actually add it to our other providers. So we need to be able to add auth activator here as an object that can be provided. Let's go ahead and run this now. Go to the shop page. No longer requires us to log in. Let's buy something. And then when we go to the checkout page, you can see it's taking us to that login page. It's not going to automatically take us to the checkout page. And so that's an important part of this. If we go cancel, it's going to take us back to the root because that catch-all took us back to this app shop because it didn't know what to do with that URL. So now that we can get to the login page, we're going to actually have to implement it, right? So let's do that next. So now let's implement that login page using form binding in Angular. Back in Visual Studio, I'm just going to clear all of the tabs. We can really focus on what we want to look at, and that is this login component, right? Now our login component already has a form to it, right? There's form for username, password, and then a submit button or a cancel button. So we want to make this actually work. And what we're going to do here is create a new constructor, and we're going to bring in the store because that's where all our data is. And we're also going to bring in the router because we're going to need both of those. Now notice I said public on store and private on router. Router isn't going to be used here in the HTML, but the store might. And so remember, we can't get at the store from the HTML unless it is public or protected. But in our case, we're actually not going to use it from the component. We're going to only use it within our actual login page. So we can leave it like that. What we're going to want is a set of credentials that we're going to actually bind to, right? This public credentials is going to be a username, and we'll start with it blank, and a password. We'll also start with it at blank. Now these are typed to strings for us because it is, of course, TypeScript. And so we should be able to bind directly to these. We'll also create a method called onLogin, and we'll just do an alert here, logging in. Let's go back to the HTML, and let's talk about how this actually works. We've got these fields, but we'd like to be able to bind to them. And so we knew we could use simple data binding like we've used before to bind to attributes and such. But because we're doing two-way data binding, we want to actually do something different. We're going to use something called ng model. And so the ng model is going to be what? Username. We're saying bind to credentials.username. Now this ng model actually needs to be told that we're binding to it. Otherwise, this is just going to create a simple attribute, right? And so what we've used before is this square brackets to say that we want to bind to something. And this would be fine if we wanted to bind directly from our page component to the HTML. We've also seen that by surrounding it with parentheses that we can do event binding. So if I said submit here, I could say on login. Right? And so the parentheses are for event binding and the brackets are for data binding, right? But ng model is a two-way bind, so you actually need both. You're telling it to not only bind to the HTML, but also as things change back to the actual component itself. And so let's copy this to both of these. Obviously, this will be password. And down below the form, I'm just going to use a data binding so we can see what the creds are. And if we switch over to where we're building this, we can see that it's complaining because ng model isn't a property on input. And the reason for this is we will need to opt into the forms module. So let's come back here and go again to our app module. You can see this is getting quite big. And what we're going to need to do is add yet another import here, and that's for the forms module. That's where all the two-way data binding exists. And this brought this in from the Angular Forms project. So if we come back here where it's building, we can see it now built fine because it knows what to do with the ng model. ng model is part of the forms binding package. We come back and refresh our page. We can see our username and password here, and even if we enter in them, we're just seeing an object because it's taken our data and tried to bind it to just a simple toString. We come back here and we just add to our creds a pipe called JSON. We can see we're actually going to get the JSON of it as well. So that pipe can be useful when you're debugging things. So what you'll see is as I type in here, that data binding is happening instantly, that even though the password isn't showing up here, that value is actually being data bound directly back there as well. And so we have this two-way data binding. Not only is the values from the component being pushed towards the form, but the changes in the form are being pushed back to the component. Make sense? And so this is the sort of the raw beginning part of what we want to do to make this page work. So now we have data binding and the forms module all working, Let's talk about validating this before we send it back to the server. So now let's look at how to validate our form. Back in Visual Studio, for each of these, let's say required. This is just an attribute that will tell it that this is a required field for us. But we want to have a way to actually make that required matter. But we want to be able to show the user that that's not working, right? And so what we're going to do here is create a new div, and we're going to use a class of text danger so that it's colored red. But we also want to be able to say, only show this if something happens. And we'd like to be able to say username and then check the error condition. But in order to use this username, we need to be able to get at what this input is, because this input is where the error is, not the credential.username. Credential.username is just a string, right? So we have to have a way of doing that. So here we can say username, and this is essentially saying create a temporary variable that I can use on this page that I want to use in the ngIf to show this error, right? But we assign that by saying what type is it, and in this case it's going to be whatever that ng model is that we have here. I'm going to say if the username invalid and username.errors.required. So this is going to be to validate based on that required label being in our input control. And then I'll just say required here. Refresh the page, we'll see required there, but as soon as we type something, it should go away. It should only show up when we actually have a required. So let's repeat this for our password. So we're going to need a pound password for that variable, and it's going to be of the page model, and then of course these are going to be password instead, right? So now we can see they're both required, but we may not want these to say required immediately, so we can add here if username.touched. So has anyone actually typed in them yet? And password touched. And with touched in there, we'll see that we don't get the error until we actually have touched that field, right? So it delays it until they've attempted to go in that particular field. Let's add one more piece, and that is for our login here. Let's bind to disabled by saying what? We're going to say username invalid or password invalid. In that case, we won't be able to use login until we actually have a valid object in there. So with required not there, it'll keep that disabled until we have a valid piece of data there, and then we'll be able to use that control. And so this validation, even though this is a really simple form, just helps us complete this in a very simple way. With our simple validation working, let's go ahead and implement the login by using the JWT tokens we saw before. So now let's use Token Authentication to make the form work. Again, back in Visual Studio, we're going to first need a new type here. So let's call this our login results. Now we could have created this using the JSON to TS, but this is such a simple type that let's go ahead and just export it as a class, login results. And this is going to have two properties, right? We're going to have a token, which is just a string, and we're going to have an expiration that's just a date. And in that same TypeScript, we can also export a class called login request. And this will be somewhat obvious to you. This will be a username as a string and a password as a string. We could have used this earlier in our login page as well to say that this should be a type of login request, right? So saying that it should be an object and it should have these properties and there should be strings. We can use that type safety there as well. But let's go ahead and look at our store because we want to implement a new method called login. Login is going to take a set of credentials and we're going to get those from login request, right? This is the information about the request. And then here we're going to use our HTTP object to post to where? We're going to post to account create token. Now this is coming straight from the controller we have, right? And so what are we going to post here? We're going to post those creds as the request. And we're going to return what we get from here, just like we did earlier with the load products. And just like before, we're going to use a pipe and a map to intercept the results so we can do something with them. There's our data, and in our data, we're just going to store our property, right? And so we can say that we expect the post to return in a login results. This is what we expect if it's not a failure. And notice that the data here is typed for us as login results. So what can we do? We can say this dot token equals data dot token, and this dot expiration equals data dot expiration, right? We just take the result that we're bringing in here and go ahead and store it here in the service so that next time after this happens, the login required should be false, right? Because the token will exist and the expiration should be after, and clearly I've messed up there, after the current date, right? The expiration should be happening after that current date. Okay, so how are we going to use this now? We're going to go back to our login page, our component here, and instead of calling logging in, we're going to say this dot store and call login. And what are we going to pass in? We're going to pass in this dot creds, and then we're going to subscribe to the result. This doesn't return us any data, so we can expect an arrow function here that's just going to have no data to it, but we can assume that the subscribe when it calls us here will be success, right? Otherwise, we can pass a second one that will have an error in it. And so let's just write to the console our error because something bad happened. Of course, we're going to want something more sophisticated, showing up a message, showing it up somewhere in our control. But we can see here that by using subscribe and then passing in success and then a failure arrow functions, that we're allowing us to handle both situations. And so what are we going to do here? We're going to say if the store order items.length is greater than 0. So if there is something in the store to check out, we're going to actually use our router to navigate to checkout. Otherwise, we'll navigate back to the store. In case someone went to the login page by default, we're going to make sure that this login process will continue to work. Now, there are more efficient and creative ways to do this. We could include the information about where to go and log in after, and if you have a number of pages, that could be useful. But this should get us to where we want to be in this very simple example. Let's make one more change here. And let's go ahead and create a public error message. That's just going to be a string. And then over on our login page, let's go ahead and just put at the top a quick div. Let's make an alert danger so that we can show something bad happen. And this is mostly just a banner that we can show information here. And we'll just do an ngIf here if the error message. So if it's not empty or null, then we'll go ahead and show the error message, right? And that way over here, instead of just showing it to the console, we can say this dot error message equals failed to log in. Right? We get a failure, which is going to include bad username and password. We'll go ahead and show that to the user. So let's see how this works. Let's go to our shop page to begin. Go ahead and buy some things. Go to checkout. It should take us here. And if we go ahead and put in our correct username and password, it should take us to the page, right? Because we successfully did it. So let's go back to shop, refresh the page. So we've lost all that state because the page has been refreshed. And I'm going to buy again, go check out. This time I'm going to put in a bad name, and it's going to show me that failed to log in. And so if I can fix this, back to Dutch Treat and log in, it'll continue the whole process. And so we can see that the login is now working in the way we want it to. It is navigating us to pages, navigating to the logout, getting us to this page. And so we really have this last step, and that is to complete our purchase. Let's do that next. So let's implement the checkout. Back in Visual Studio, let's go to our store service. We're going to add yet another method here called checkout, right? And so checkout is essentially going to take the order we have here in the store, and we're going to want to send it to the server. So we're going to do the same thing we've done before, which is use HTTP, and we're going to use post again. And here we're just going to go to API orders, right? We're going to post what? This.order. Which is going to contain our original object plus all the items that someone has requested. And so if we go over to our checkout page, we're going to want to implement this. Remember, we just had the checkout here. And let's say this.store.checkout. And then we're going to want to subscribe just like we've done before. And in this case, it doesn't look like there's anything happening with subscribe, right? If it succeeded, we're really just going to want to move back to the main page. So let's come in here and just say private router, because we're going to need that as well in order to do that. And again, private because we're actually binding to elements of the store there. And we'll just say this.router.navigate. Done this enough that you should be comfortable with that. Otherwise, we're going to get the error that we may not use it. And just say this.error message equals failed to check out. And we'll go ahead and include the error in there in this case because it may actually be useful to know about that. So a couple of pieces here we need to make sure. Let's make sure we have a property called error message of type string, or actually let's go ahead and give it an empty string to begin with. And let's go ahead and open up the HTML. So we can go ahead and add this at the top. Div ng if error message. And because you can see we're doing this more than once, to be a classic place where you might want to create a reusable component. But with our limited time, I'm just going to do it twice. So this should give us a checkout page that should work. And so let's make sure that in the HTML, we have this button success, and when we click the complete purchase on checkout, it should go ahead and do that execution of the checkout. And let's make sure one last thing, and that is our error message is cleared every time we click on checkout so that we don't see that error over and over again. So we're back in our project. Let's start fresh just to make sure we have everything. Checkout. Let's go ahead and bring in our username or password. And when we say complete purchase, we're getting a failed to checkout. And there's something about that error object that we want to know about. Let's go ahead and look at the network call. Let's reload this. Log in, and because we reloaded the page, we've lost some of that state. And there are ways to get around that, but for us, this should be fine. Let me unclick all that, and let's just add our couple of items here. Checkout, and when we say complete purchase, let's see what happens to our request. Let's in fact only include XHR requests. So we see the create token happening, getting the products. What happened here? Orders returned a failure, which was a 401. Unauthorized. Unauthorized, I logged in, right? Well, normally when you log in with ASP.NET MVC, the credentials are actually stored in a cookie. And so you could assume that. But in our case, we're storing them in that token. And in our service, we're not using them, right? We're storing them here as the token and the expiration date. But when we checked out, we weren't using them. And so let's do two things. First, let's create an object called headers, which is of type HTTP headers. We'll see those included for us. And then we can just set the authorization header to what? We're going to set it to bearer. Let's use this fancy syntax. This.token, right? We're creating a header for the authorization. We set this by adding an object as our third parameter and setting a property called headers and assigning it our new headers object. And in this way, it is actually going to use the token information when we do the post, because we're sending the authorization header in our operation. And while we're here, we're also going to want to call pipe and map like we did before. We're not actually going to use the data here, so we can actually just keep a empty percentage there, because if it succeeded, which this pipe will call, we're going to want to say this order equals new order, right? we're going to want to clear out the old order and create a brand new order for us to start a new operation with. So let's go back and start the whole process over again. We'll fill in our login. We'll add a couple of products. We'll check out. We'll complete the purchase. We're still getting an error. And of course, we're still showing it as an object, which isn't as helpful. But if we look at the browser, we'll actually see, if we try to complete the purchase again, that we're getting a 400 bad requests. And so let's take a look at that request. We can see in the response, it's saying order number is required. Now, we've never specified the order number, so let's go ahead and do that. If we go to our shared again to that order, and since this order number is required, we're just going to generate one. Probably better ways to do this, but at least to get us started, I'm going to say generate a random number. We have our order number. We go ahead and go home and let's go to that shop, buy a couple shirts. Going to see me doing this a lot, and let's say complete purchase, still failed. Let's find out why. So if we look at the network again, let's complete purchase again, because of course it didn't clear the order because there was a failure. Let's take a look and see what happens. So if we look at the request, there's our order number. It's 5 characters, should be fine. Looks like we have all the pieces we have there. But in our response, it just says failed to save new order. So this is a server-side issue. And if we come back over to Visual Studio, let's go ahead and look at the output, because the output is going to have the output of the server log that were created. And if I look at this, it's going to say an error occurred while updating the entries. And one of the things it says is cannot insert an explicit value for products. Well, why is it trying to insert into products? The reason is it doesn't know that those objects aren't new. So let's take a look at that server code for a minute. So if we go to our orders controller, remember that when we post to it, let's come down here to the post, we're just mapping our order from our model back into the new order. And this is setting all those product values as new objects. So it really has to do with going from order model to order in our mapping. We don't want to bring those products in as if they're new products. We just want to keep the product. And remember, the order item has a product. What we're going to want to do is add a new field to our order item because we don't want to create the new object, and we're going to call it product ID. Now, because it has the same ID as the member on here, it's going to allow us to set just the product ID if that's what we need. This is underlying allowing that mapping to actually happen. So with that in place, let's go over to the maps. And we have a order-to-order view model, and that's how we were spitting them out. And then we have this reverse map. We're going to do this for the order items view model to the order item, because that's where the products are at fault. And so when we go from order item to order view model, we should be fine. It's the reverse. We're going to want to say for member product, ignore. So we're going to essentially tell it not to map. We go from here to here, the product to the product ID. But since our order view model already has a product ID on it, it will naturally map it back to our product ID so that the foreign key still continues to work. We're just not pretending that this new object is a new object that's being bound to it. We were just including the product in the order item so that we can refer to it in the client. Make both of those changes and let's run it again. Let's go to our shop. Let's buy a couple of items. Let's go ahead and log in. Let's go to complete the purchase. And it completed it, right? It took us back to this page with no errors. If we go back over to Visual Studio, let's go ahead and look in our database. For orders, let's view the data. And we can see today, which happens to be 3/8. There's our magic order number. This order 6 had just been added, and that for order ID, we had just ordered these 2 line items. And so our API is now working, and because I'm still logged in, if I went to buy something more and go to checkout, it's going to take me directly to checkout. And so the idea here is that you have a statefulness to your Angular application. Now you have a fully functional Angular app. Let's go ahead and wrap up this module. So what have we learned? I've shown you that creating routes is pattern-based, just like ASP.NET MVC, so you should be familiar with some of the same things, except these routes are going to be done on the client, not on the server. I've talked about the idea of views and pages being very similar to server-side MVC, and that you should conceptualize them as very similar, though how they're implemented is in fact very different. And I've also shown you by using that central state, that store object, we can keep state when switching those views. I've only really scratched the surface on Angular. We haven't had a lot of time in this long end-to-end course to cover Angular, so I do recommend that you look for other Angular courses here on Pluralsight. There's a great getting started one from W. Kurata that is a good place to get a more deep knowledge of Angular. You should just have an idea of what you would use it for and some of the basics of it from my course. But by no means should you expect that you can build a brand new Angular app just by these last 3 modules. Up next, we're going to talk about how you're going to take this application you've written and deploy it.